in that direction, some one way or another?
Westernized. They adopted liberal democracies, and this is the point. The West has assumed for a long time, rather arrogantly, that the two are mutually.
All right, welcome to Mutagenic. We're listening to Twitter Spaces at the same time about the Ukraine-Russia situation.
And so why people now look at Ukraine is because Ukraine, at least in theory, is trying to become a liberal democracy and a market.
It's Marian of
Is that why they canceled out all political parties and controlled state media? Is that the echoes of democracy in Ukraine? Outlawing political parties and taking over media stations?
No, again, I'm not going into specifics. I'm just trying to say in principle what is trying to be done. I don't disagree with your points in specifics.
I wanted to say something on this point to bring it back to media, which was at the top of the discussion.
And Mario,
thank you so much for having these discussions with balance. And after I speak, I would really like Wyatt Reed to come up, because he is a journalist who's in the Donbass region. He almost was killed by Ukrainian military. He was targeted. He's targeted on a website called the Ukrainian Kill List. They call it the Peacemaker List, ironically. But he'll tell you the details of that. But Wyatt Reed has a great deal of knowledge of the war crimes that the Ukrainian military is committing against their own civilians and Russians, without any from the media, anything.
But it's important. So I would love to cover those. And I'd also
back to the media. So what I'm trying to say about the media is this: you mentioned, you threw out the tweet, and then we talked earlier at the top about why people don't like the media. In the West, 22 corporations own all the Western media. It's become very condensed. It becomes more of a narrative. Many of like MSNBC and CNN is stacked with intelligence community, former CIA, or people that have a vested economic interest in outcomes, particularly in the military-industrial complex, like Raytheon. Now, I worked for Leon Panetta, Joe Biden. I worked for that in the past and studied international relations and have a law degree. And what I can tell you is there has always been an agenda to bring Russia to its knees. It's not been hidden. It's very overt. And they did not, after the fall, and they were recovering, particularly after Vladimir Putin's speech in 2007, when he talked about a multipolar world. There was an agenda to very much disenfranchise Russia. And in fact, the words that I heard in person were, they will never get a seat at the table. And what many people see is this is an aggression towards, by NATO. They're up against Russian borders. And if you look at the map, how close that is to power centers. There was also a discussion that no one's been saying, and Piotr, I'm sure, can attest to this. Zelensky himself threatened in January to use nuclear weapons. So there was intelligence and things coming to Russia about the aggression of NATO. So it wasn't small. It was very, very big. But we're not hearing about it in our Western media.
Doesn't have any nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I was just going to say Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons, so how can they threaten to use them?
And remember, they have the West behind them. This is a proxy war.
But they have the West. But there's other countries that have the West behind them. Like it's not a bad thing to have the West behind you. So what point you make?
If it causes death and if it escalates to a global conflict, like last week when you had your spaces, Piotr, with all due respect, immediately said that was a Russian missile, and he was relying on intelligence.
I said it was most likely. I never said
most likely. But the point is that AP was a Western media
outlet. You can customize the items. That's cool.
Reported it as if it was fact.
It's kind of new.
And had one unnamed source and did not look at the photographs that were someone that was on the ground.
So it actually wasn't an unnamed source. The problem actually came in, and the AP released these text messages have already been leaked. There was an issue inside of the Associated Press's direct media system where when one of the people said that they had already cleared this particular source for this data, it was confused to mean what they actually meant is that source had been cleared prior by the AP, hadn't been cleared actually for this particular source, and they pushed it and ran with it in a series of confused texts.
Right, and their Slack messaging.
Yes, and their Slack messages.
But they kept referring to an official source. But anyway, what I wanted to bring up was the war crimes. Like, for instance, the 11 Russian soldiers that were just executed. They were shot in the head. They were laying on their bellies in surrender position.
Russian soldiers? Can you provide a source for that? I don't know of 11 Russian soldiers.
The source for that, the New York Times, actually, it was on the front page.
Yeah, I think I saw that. I saw that as well. I think Piotr.
Yeah.
And yes, I look at. But I want to just add one point to it, Tara. Would you say?
I wanted to say.
I'll let you finish. Don't worry. Okay, but I just wanted to add to the war crimes thing. Like the war crimes argument is an argument that both parties of almost every war make. And I think it's just part of war. That's why I've always been anti-war. So I think you'll see war crimes on both sides of this war. But correct me if I'm wrong if anyone has information against
Mario, this is the thing. The war crimes by Ukrainian military are not being covered in Western media.
But you said it's on New York Times.
What
are these?
Times and Reuters
I was getting to that, and the reason why I think that it was on the front of the New York Times is tied into the whole crypto thing, the FTX. I think that the money laundering is becoming more and more clear, and this is just, I think the FTX is one small part of all of this. The Biden administration is now going to be under investigation for corruption.
No, they're not.
The news report from the New York Times.
They will never be under investigation for anything.
If I can just add a couple of points to this,
No, absolutely not. The New York Times just reported on the Russian.
Yeah, so this is a Twitter Spaces that covers kind of like there's usually tens of thousands of people listening to this. Elon Musk was there, Kim.com is there.
I mean,
actually right now even.
As a person and working in
there's a lot of
fields, and I'm telling you, there is
the Binance CEO was there and so on during the FTX
big weapons manufacturers to make as much profits as they can.
And so
look at their
whatever gets said in this Twitter Spaces.
Of this conflict in February to now, and this conflict began really 8 years ago with Victoria.
Ahead of time because this is live, so I'm not ahead of time aware of what is going to be said. So
7%, 12% of Nazis.
I don't approve or disapprove of anything.
Okay, so there's a lot of claims. So Tara, let's just there's been
unless I say something about it.
You know what? Okay, so let me say one more thing.
Do you mind, Tara? We'll do. Tara, you're very passionate, Tara. You're extremely passionate, well spoken. So
you all talk over me, but you let each other talk.
No. So what I'm trying to do, because the only reason I did is there's just because. What I want to try to do is get each claim discussed one by one, and there was a few claims made from the war crimes to the Nazis and the coverage by New York Times. So what I'll do is yeah, of course, I'll let you address them, and then we'll go back to Tara's final point, and then I'll let you address that, and then we'll go to Michael right after, if that's okay, Michael. Go ahead, Piotr.
Yeah. Okay. So let's be very clear. Has there been war crimes on both sides, or has there been actions of questionable and appalling action on both
Salamander,
sides?
life regeneration, amplifier, 20% damage.
Good at the information war campaign. Yes, they are. They're much better at it than the Russians. Are they good?
They max out the
poison
dart, I guess it did.
In terms of Western media outlets, and is it clear that more Western media outlets are sympathetic to the Ukrainian side than they are to the Russians? Yes, that is very much true, and I don't think anyone should be afraid to say that. If you read a news report like Al Jazeera, for example, which is Qatarian, and the Qatari, and if you look at the way that they frame things, the language that they use, it's a little bit more neutral. If you read the South Chinese Morning Post, which is well, it's not owned by the CCP, but it is of Chinese influence in the South Asian region. They frame the war much more differently than, say, the BBC or the New York Times. And I agree.
I need like 48 of these things, maybe.
Post have been, papers that have a certain framing when it comes to the conflict. Now, I personally find the New York Times to be a bit too left-leaning for me. I prefer more neutral, centrist media outlets because you get more of just a depiction of the information that's happening. So I don't disagree with some of Tara's sentiments there. Then when we're just to her point about 2014 and 13, I will appreciate the point that the West has undertaken interventionary means in other countries around the world to influence the way that the developments. Look at what they did in the Latin American states over the 80s and 70s, propping up, fascist groups, dictatorships to prevent the spread of what they consider to be the communism. So the West has a very, very hypocritical record when it comes to interventionism.
You get any of this?
Business. And I do think that there is a obsession here in Washington, D.C., where I live at the moment, towards making Russia the boogeyman for lots of different things. That being said, I wouldn't say that the events in 2013 and 14 were the underlying cause of this war. They go much further back. I've already talked about the historical context. I think the Orange Revolutions, the Color Revolutions are very important. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the expansion of NATO eastwards, all these factors play into where we are now. Russia's actions over Georgia in 2008, over Chechnya in the 1990s, all very relevant, I think, to the way that the West and Russia look at one another in this current framing. So,
and just before we move forward, the Orange Revolution is essentially the revolution that where Ukraine was forced to change governments. 2014, no?
No, there's been multiple different revolutions, if you want to call them that.
Which one is the one that toppled? Which one is the one that toppled the government?
This is nonsense, please. A lot of these protests, as is evidenced by the videos of Victoria Nuland being on the side, John McCain giving speeches at the demonstrations, and then later it turned out that
okay, so from those you get those yellow ones.
Protests, the snipers
you really need
used to shoot
look at that, like, so much more effective than this poison dart.
Were people that were backed by
I chose the wrong starting weapon, but hey, whatever.
That wanted to change the Yanukovych government.
So some curses, maybe.
More evidence from even European leaders. The foreign minister
the Blizzard seems good.
Was recorded, and this is all available on YouTube and on Rumble, talking about the nationalists staging these sniper attacks in order to escalate the protests, and they have succeeded in that. The people rose up against this violence, and Yanukovych was ousted and fled to Russia, and a new government was installed. So that is what happened.
Do you want to comment on that one, Piotr, before we go?
The claim over the coup thing has never been fully established. It's something that a lot of more Russian sympathetic, sides tend to suggest.
Peter, come on. That came out. Watch Ukraine on Fire. Watch Oliver Stone. Watch the Victoria. WikiLeaks came out with it. New York Times, Washington Post, all followed up with the reporting of emails and phone calls and recordings of it being a coup.
Well,
American funded.
Even more importantly, there is a study from an independent Canadian professor who has looked at all of
that's Kim.com right now.
That became available in the so-called sniper trials in Ukraine, and his assessment and his well-received study from experts around the world is a dozen of pages report that suggests that this was the nationals that hired the snipers to kill the demonstrators and police. All of that is public information. That is
Chad, do you mind
just read about that.
Do you mind verifying that information, Chad? Because it's important information. If you could look into it in the background.
I literally just know this information too, as well as Piotr does now, and other people on the stage here. That these are claims that have been made. There are people that do make these claims. There are people that say that there are potential sources on both sides here. Once again, this is something that has not actually been confirmed by enough reliable sources for us to actually say with certainty. Now, the question of would the United States be involved in proxy battles, etc. That's a long-standing historical thing that the United States has been involved in. Would it be surprising if we had some involvement with it? No, it would not be surprising. Would it be surprising if Russia also had some involvement with the Wagner Group, etc. on the opposing side? No, that wouldn't be surprising either. Russia also does these exact same operations. Let's look at Afghanistan. Let's look at pretty much any of the other places where these proxy battles have happened. It's because there's two sides to that battle. It's not just because the United States is rushing in and just being empirical in some of these areas, even though I wouldn't say that I stand up for what happened necessarily in the 70s, etc., down in the Contra era and some of the stuff that happened down there. There's a lot of issues with that situation. But I would say the overall prevailing view, there isn't just an overall prevailing view that says yes.
It's a little more than a situation.
By the United States. This coup was caused by a whole bunch of other fracturing issues inside of the Ukrainian population that were leading up to this moment as well. And there's been a back and forth battle of the Ukrainian political system, both between Russia and the United States. Oleg Deripaska is connected with some of the same financiers. that were also helping to influence, elections in Ukraine. And Oleg Deripaska is one of Putin's right-hand men. So, I think it's very hard to say that this is an easy, cut and dry, yes, one side or other caused this directly. This is very blurred. There's a lot of
NATO and the United States has dedicated almost $80 billion to this conflict in Ukraine. That amount is staggering.
Tiny portion of our annual budget. We have a $1 trillion budget.
I mean,
So
Chet, what would you make of
here's
Victoria
something I
Nuland's
would suggest.
leaked
Just a second,
recordings?
please. Just a second. So here's something I would suggest. All of the stuff that I've just been talking about, I don't just want you to believe me. I pinned a tweet to the top that says, here are my essential tweets about the US proxy war in Ukraine. All the information about how the 2014 coup d'etat in Ukraine led to this crisis is in there. Documentaries, documents, reports from Western sources, like it's all summed up in this one thread. So if you want to educate yourself about it, it's right on top.
So I'm not going to go into
Chest now.
Yeah, so I'll let you respond, Piotr, and then I'll go to Michael,
like
Max, and Dimitri.
chest is always like
I
one
think you
only.
should really call on Wyatt Reed, who's on the ground in Donbass.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
So Wyatt, whenever you're ready to speak, Wyatt, do put your hand up, bro. I'd love to get your thoughts as well, and your take on all this.
Back on one other thing too. I mean, we also know that literally at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the FSB and the ATO
it uses those.
the Ukrainian government.
That's not worth it, is it?
So like we're pretending this is just a one-sided potential
What do you get?
coup d'état attempt. That
What
doesn't
do you
make any
get for
sense to
that?
me. We're talking about two sides of these forces that
It uses
have
those
distinctly different interests in this
materials
country.
that you can also use for meta.
Yeah,
I would follow the money. I mean, and I think FTX is going to be a really good.
Oh, Tari, you got
One only.
mate. It's that's overblown. There's not enough evidence.
Well,
It's
is it
driving
overblown?
force.
We don't know yet,
Yes, it
do
is.
we?
This is a war
don't.
about history and strategy, not about fucking.
No, but what it will reveal is communications between democratic elites and Sam that were taking place right funding.
Oh, no.
It's purely speculation.
Suddenly, the driver of the
It's not
entire.
speculation.
I think you can look at it right now and see that some of the investigation has started. And you can already
Sometimes we
tell
like
the
to
direction.
look for.
Well, let's not leave out the neocons, right? This isn't just the left. A lot of the right
32 Republicans voted for the funding for the war.
Okay, well that's good to know, Prodigal. I would just say, look, I think there's a really
Alright,
good
survived a
article
little
that
bit.
I highly encourage
Let's see if we can
everyone to read.
customize the
People who are
projectile amount
pro-Ukrainian
in
and will think I'm a pro-Russian.
for
Trust
the
me, guys.
poison
You're listening to
darts.
me.
I'm kind of like,
I've been called a Russian troll. I've been
what?
attacked a lot for people
Okay.
thinking that I'm a Russian sympathizer. It's
Upgrade
hilarious that I'm
what?
on the other side in for most
1,000.
of the time, but what I would say
clearly
is,
don't sound like
1,000? Are you
no,
kidding me?
but no,
Don't
trust
worry
me,
about
Kim.
it.
I've gotten death threats from it. I'm not joking. Anyway, my point is
God,
that
dude.
there's a really good article
It's a
from
lot.
Foreign Affairs from 8 years ago
1,000.
called "Why Crimea is the West's Fault." It was written by a controversial but very well-known academic called John Mearsheimer, and he talks about why part of the responsibility of Crimea rests with NATO and the West. Again, I'm not going to say whether or not I 100% agree with that article, but for balance,
I'm complete
I
that
highly
poison
encourage
dart
you to
anymore.
read it
Let's
for
take some
themselves,
other
because
one.
it does offer a very
Arc, Claw, Orb, Shuriken,
interesting
First
and
Orb.
nuanced reasoning around what happened in 2014 and the lead up to that with the coup or the
Okay,
riot or whatever you want to call it. Highly recommend it.
Actually, Mearsheimer has made a very powerful speech about this coup d'etat in Ukraine and what the effects will be. So he has predicted this whole war and how Ukraine is going to get wrecked, how the West is responsible for that. All these videos are part of the tweet that I just mentioned about the essential facts that everyone needs to know about the Ukraine war, and you can just see the pinned tweet on top, and the Mearsheimer speech is in there as well.
I'll go to Michael. Michael, thanks for patiently waiting. Kim, I've sent you an important message on Signal. If you can please check it out in the meantime. Michael, go ahead, man. Thanks for waiting.
Great. Thanks, Mario. So just for background, I'm a securities lawyer. I happen to have been following the war in Ukraine from the beginning in quite a lot of detail. There are a lot of people up on the panel here who I think like to talk way more than I do. So I'm going to be fairly quiet. But I think Kim's idea about sharing resources is great because as Mario noted, it seems like claims are flying by really quickly, on lots of different fronts, and providing sources is something I really appreciate. So for those who may not be in spaces very often, if you look at the top of the space, there's an area, some people call it the nest, some people call it the Jumbotron. It's a resource area. And so up there, I've posted some sources that relate to things that have already been discussed, including Ukraine's connections with FTX, which I wrote about a week ago. I included an examination of the shooting in Makivka of Russian soldiers that I think is very thoughtful. I also included the debate that was done at the Monk Center early on in the war between Michael McFaul and John Mearsheimer. So that way you're not just hearing Mearsheimer's speech, you're hearing him in debate, with his opposing views. It's like an hour and a half long, but it's just a helpful resource that if people are interested, they can go away and follow up on it later. And then way back at the first item posted back in the nest is a page posted by NATO with their own comments on debate, discussion about NATO expansion and their talks with Russia. So I'm going to be pretty quiet, but as I'm listening, when I hear claims, I'm going to try and go and get sources and put them in the nest. So
yeah. So any claims, I actually messaged Chet as well. Chet to be active. So Chet and Kim, just please check your DMs, guys. It's important because you're both co-hosts. So Chet, I sent you a message to please make sure any claims made that are unverified or we can't back them with evidence. I'd always like you to jump in and mention that. And yeah, any claim made by anyone, it's always good to mention the source. And Michael, on the claims made so far, any specific ones to point out? Like there was, for example, one claim that was made about Ukrainian separatists shooting the protesters, and the sources of those were questioned by two panelists. Is there any claims that you would question that we've heard on the panel so far?
So, for example, with FTX, if you have a look at my tweet, which is posted in the nest, I actually opened by asking the Ukrainian Minister of Digital Infrastructure, Digital Development, if he could provide more detail. But then down thread, I explained that Ukraine engaged FTX as an agent to receive donations via a program they were running that ran from.
Actually, Michael, can you give me context? How the fuck are we talking about FTX when it's about Ukraine? Why is FTX in the discussion?
Well, so Terra raised it, and I think that's because there are claims going around that there are incentives for the United States administration to continue support for Ukraine because there's some financial angle whereby they're receiving a flow of funds back, and that FTX is sort of the connection point whereby funds going to Ukraine might come back to the US. But I don't think that is the case. And if you have a look at my thread, it explains that Ukraine engaged FTX to be agent to receive donations in crypto, that they ultimately received only $60 million during that 1 month.
Okay, what happened to space? I don't know.
Probably.
There you go. It's
like
back.
Almost
sometimes rocks a little bit.
$1 million, and that Ukraine then replaced that program with a different program where they went with a different crypto agent afterwards. So they dropped their association with FTX way back in May. So I'm not seeing any real tie there. I also would highlight the post by No Cledor, which looks like it's been removed from the nest, probably by one of the co-hosts, but I'll put it back up. That looks at the shooting in Makivka, and it looks at camera angles. There's an overhead drone shot. There's ground video, and it makes the argument that essentially, when the last Russian, or presumably one of the last Russians surrendering, came out and opened fire on the Ukrainians, they would have returned fire, to defend themselves, and that because of the way that their heavy guns were set up relative to the surrendering group, it's likely that several of those who had tried to surrender and were laying down would have been, in the zone at risk through line of fire, and that therefore, it's that one Russian open fire. There's a actually under the laws of war, there's a crime called perfidy, where if you attempt to surrender.
So this is I got it. So essentially, this is the story mentioned earlier, where a war crime was perpetrated by Ukrainian soldiers against Russian soldiers, and what you're saying is that there's footage that you've pinned above that shows that there's a Russian soldier that came out, the last one, actually shot at Ukrainian, and they shot back, and because of the way the weapons are positioned, etc., it killed all the soldiers. I think that one, like whichever side is the correct one, it's really hard to prove either one. Like, would you agree, Michael and Tara? I'll actually ask both of you before we go to Max. Would you agree that in a war you'll see war crimes perpetrated in most cases by both sides? Like, it's very difficult to find a war where neither side, because there's good people and bad people in every country, every religion. It's difficult to see a war in which war crimes were not perpetrated by either side. Is that a fair statement? Like, would you think that both sides
that was interesting.
likely perpetrated some sort of war crimes?
I think in this case, what the other issue is just the disinformation that's out there. For instance, many Ukrainians, or like they call them the NATO trolls. Like I'm followed and threatened by NATO, and I think Peter referred to them. They carry the line. They've been talking about that it was Purdy, that the Russian opened fire, and that's why. But if you look at it, and that's why the UN is investigating it as a war crime, because the shots were to the head and they were executed in on their bellies with their hands.
Okay, so the UN. So Tara, did you say the UN is actually investigating that particular incident as a war crime? Correct.
Correct. Yes. They've opened the investigation. I don't know if they're actively investigating. It's just
Blizzard is the best.
But my point was, with all of that and bringing it up, was simply that it was very rare for the New York Times to cover something like that. There's been consistent crimes. 14,000 plus Russian nationals have been murdered by Azov Nazi battalions or nationalist battalions in Ukraine, and that's been part of the impetus for the Russians to be in that region to protect those that have been that are under threat. And I think that's where I'd like Wyatt Reed to jump in, because he has direct knowledge from the ground and talked to the people and has his own experience. And so Wyatt, if you're there,
we'll go to what? Yeah,
I just want to speak one point.
Just a second. I have a suggestion here. Because time is precious, this is a really important debate. I think before we talk about, the individual war crimes of the different countries and specific, timely events like the rockets that hit Poland and all of that, I think what we should talk about first is really the context of the war, the motives that led to the war, and why we are here. And then when we have time later, maybe we go into the individual.
I agree. I think it's Yeah, I'll let you. I want to get Michael and then Piotr just to comment on this point, since I already gave Tara the opportunity to talk about it, and then we'll move on to more the context of the war. But yeah, Piotr and then Michael. Go ahead, guys.
Yeah, no, I'm keen to hear from people within the country. Obviously, it's incredibly important to hear from those who have empirical insights. It's grossly changed since I was there in late August. And but what I would just say is, with any modern day warfare, well, including historical, I guess, to be fair, but more now than ever, and this war particularly, what the Ukraine war has illustrated to us, much like the Gulf War of the 1990s, when CNN was the first broadcaster to begin 24/7 broadcasting, information of video footage of on the ground events. This war has been plagued by social media and the role of, online, shall we say, open source intelligence, mis and disinformation on both sides, perhaps. But the point is, there's an information overload, and in any war, you have to be the one who's able. If you can win the information war, you can have a great opportunity to win the actual kinetic and the physical war, right? So both countries are undertaking very, very targeted and systematic information war campaigns to deliver certain perspectives of the war to certain audiences. If you look at the Russians, they portray things in a very specific way. A lot of the national news networks, TASS,
Increase
fans
enemy
to
movement
certain
speed. Well, that's a
mainstream,
nice
present
mutation to
things in a
get.
certain way. If you look at it comparatively to, say, not even the BBC, but Ukrainian-specific media, and this is all to do with keeping morale up. It's about keeping, the provision of supplies of food, aid, or whatever it is from supporting countries in the conflict. Now, Ukraine has done a very effective job at least in some people's minds, of using social media to provide very convincing and sort of, well, they're very well, should we say, manicured pieces. Don't forget, Zelensky was an actor, and he's clearly brought some of that experience with him to the Ministry of Digital Information, which he set up, I think, after he won the election in 2019. So there's a lot of elements to this which,
I'll go.
but I'll
I'll
stop.
go. Yeah, I'll go to Michael just on that. Just finish that particular point before we move on to as Kim mentioned, just the general context of the war. Michael, go ahead.
Sure. So, Mario, your question was, are war crimes being committed by both sides? And the answer is yes. I mean, you can't have hundreds of thousands of people fighting without some people breaking the rules. There are lots of organizations that are investigating these things. I think what you need to look at are things like scale, so how widespread war crimes are, initiation, so is it
War
individual
crimes.
soldiers,
War, in
losing
and of
their
itself,
cool
should be a
and,
crime.
shooting somebody that's when in a circumstance that's unjustifiable, or is it a systematic approach that's being directed by officers or other leadership, to coordinate a system of actions that are illegal, and then following that, if crimes are committed, are they being investigated and punished by each of the combatant sides? And so, if for example, there's a systemic approach where they're being directed to commit war crimes, obviously there's not going to be any investigation and follow up. However, if they're more isolated incidents, then they're less frequent, which is one thing. And then the other point is their commanders may then investigate and punish, right? And so we need to look at those features. And I think that there's a clear difference between the way that Ukraine is handling these instances and the way that Russia is handling these instances. And I think that's being reported by the international organizations that are going in to investigate. I'd also like to make the point that there are several instances of alleged war crimes where international organizations would like to investigate, like the prisoner of war camp at Olenivka, where Russia claims it was a Ukrainian strike. Ukraine claims it was essentially a bombing of prisoners as a false flag, and organizations like the Red Cross would like to go in to investigate because under international law they have some authority to oversee the welfare of prisoners, and they have been denied by the Russians. So we
you can get like materials
you can't
from
just
those.
say both sides are committing crimes. You have to look at the nature of the crimes, how widespread
something.
they are they being punished, are they allowing investigation to occur? And I have lots of sources I can provide on this, but I know I don't want to overwhelm the nest with resources, but there's a lot out there on this if you have a look.
I'll go to Max and
can I
yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Can I have 5 minutes? Because I've been listening to everyone now, and I think we have a pretty good debate. It's not too heated. It's civil. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. But I think what's important for people to understand, and I'm always being asked this question: why did this start? Why did the U.S. decide to want to topple the Ukrainian government to install a pro-Western government? And you have to look back at 2007. In 2007, Putin gave a speech in Munich, which is only referred to as the Munich speech today, to the global security elites. They meet once a year in Germany, and at that speech, he criticized what he called the United States' monopolistic dominance in global relations and its almost uncontained hyperuse of force in international relations. This speech claimed that no one feels safe because no one can feel that international law is like a wall.
I wouldn't want to increase the enemy movement speed.
Because of these U.S.
That's
foreign
kind of
policies that
they so that I can kill them faster, I suppose,
so
or what?
he basically stepped on the United States foreign policy in front of the world security elite and said, we're not
Plus one
going to
capacity.
accept that anymore. And then what followed
Capacity for
that
what?
event in 2009, after the financial crisis,
Right.
the collapse of Lehman,
So I can go up to
and,
what, 4?
the total financial crisis around the world, which was triggered by it.
Mutagenic capacity, right?
Putin
Okay.
says, and many other
So need like.
non-Western leaders say the U.S. government was responsible because of its
What's that do?
lax rules at the time. In 2009, Putin and Xi Jinping and other leaders came together and said, we need to start a new organization. We need to create an alternative to the Western system.
Idea.
And they called it the BRICS, right? And the BRICS, from its creation, has said we are going to challenge the dominance of the US dollar in the global financial system.
This character had a lot of
And we
buffs.
are going to take away
Let's see if the shotgun's good or not.
dominant
It seems
status of the
pretty
US when it
good.
comes to global
I mean,
financial affairs. And
oh,
this
more
is
projectiles
really
even?
what
Come on.
triggered the United States.
One shot.
Can we stop with the stupid sound effects?
I don't know why we had this clapping, but let me just finish my point.
That was my mistake. I hit the wrong button. I apologize.
Yeah. So when you look at these major geopolitical events that are challenging the dominance of U.S. hegemony around the world, that is when the U.S. decided, okay, we need to do something against Russia and China. And ever since then, you will have noticed in the last 10 years, things got tenser and tenser with both Russia and China. And the build-up, to the 2014 events is because of this very challenge that, Putin and China have dared to challenge U.S. power. And now the U.S., of course, feels threatened in its global status.
I've been completely like spoiled by these games because I really can't even like play any other types of games anymore.
Going to raise the
Apparently.
money that it needs for its 800 billion a year military, for the debt that it requires.
This is something about it. It's like active. It's fast. It's like I don't play games to like constrain like to strain my brain a lot.
In budget.
I have to think all day
The things are
for what I do.
out of control.
So I play games to kind of just switch off my brain, literally.
For its survival, it needs to challenge Russia
And
China,
this kind of like these types of games are just kind of perfect for that.
It loses the reserve currency, and that will be the collapse of basically the U.S. empire. So this is what you need to understand as the global dynamic that is being played
I want
out
to
here.
just speak to a couple of points there.
I'll let you do it, and then just Dimitri and Max, I'll let you go, and Wyatt, I'll let you go after Piotr responds to Kim. Go ahead, Piotr.
Yeah. So I agree with Kim in that.
I mean, this shotgun's OP.
Speech, as it's known, was a very, very important.
Projectile speed. Projectile speed is also just amazing on the shotgun. It has multiple. It's like everything. It's just everything. Multiple projectiles. Amazing like damage. Projectile speed is insane. Let's just do that. So it shoots like really fast. It has piercing. Like, oh my god! It's just like, it's just so much better than anything else. Like, orders of magnitude better almost. Well, not almost, it is. So upgrade the damage, 20%. These die from one shot. Okay, what happened to spaces? Hang on, let me check.